Your novel could be as boring as the introduction to this video. Of all the things you want your novel to be called, boring is probably not at the top of the list of things you want it to be called. You'll really have to bore into that sentence to figure out what the hell I was trying to say. It's important to note that there are many different things that can cause a novel to be boring, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's start by defining boredom. This is going to be a thrilling video. Speaking of boredom, if you want less of it, or possibly more of it, consider subscribing to my channel. I guarantee you won't be bored. Oh, I was going to bring an actual board as a visual aid, but I forgot. Boredom is the state of being bored. A state where one lacks interest, where the activities one is engaged in feel flat and empty. An experience completely devoid of emotion, an experience that you want to end. Boredom is not an idea in and of itself, but rather a lack of something. A lack of excitement, a lack of engagement, a lack of curiosity, a lack of emotion. We are naturally drawn away from situations that we feel are boring as a sort of defense mechanism. Boredom is meant to move us away from something that we get no value from, something that has no stimulation. Now, not being bored is not an inherently positive thing. You can be not bored in both good and bad ways. Going on a date with a fun and engaging person means you aren't bored in a positive way. You have curiosity, excitement, and you are engaged in the experience. Being inside a helicopter that's in the process of crashing into the ocean is not boring, but in a decidedly negative way. In this case, you have fear, anxiety, which when you boil it right down is just kind of like unpleasant curiosity, and you are also engaged because of the crashing helicopter and whatnot. This is an important consideration, as moving someone from bored to not bored can either involve moving them into something positive or something negative. Now, with a novel, there is another element that we need to consider. When the reader reads a novel, they themselves don't experience the events of the story. They read about people who experience those events, or sea turtles that experience those events if you're writing for primarily a sea turtle audience. You, the writer, need to connect the reader to the characters experiencing the events of your story. If you fail to do this, then even a novel filled with exciting events could end up being boring. A novel can be boring because the events it describes are themselves boring, or because the reader feels no connection to the people experiencing those events, or the sea turtles experiencing those events if you write primarily for a sea turtle audience. I mentioned at the beginning that boredom fundamentally makes us want to do something else. When you read a boring book, you want to put it down and watch a movie or read a different book. So fundamentally, a not boring novel is a novel that someone wants to keep reading. This does not just mean having an exciting novel full of exciting stuff like car chases and gunfights and kissing and all that kind of stuff. I think making a non-boring novel comes down to a couple of different elements. You have to first create curiosity in the reader, and you have to make progress towards resolution of that curiosity in a way that is on some level exciting. The hook that people talk about needing in the first part of your novel, the hook that people talk about you needing in the first part of your novel, is really just about spurring curiosity in the reader. You give them something that they want to know more about. We want to know who murdered the butler. Was it the upstairs butler or the head butler? Or the chief butler? Most of the characters in this hypothetical mystery novel are just butlers. We want to know if the dwarves are going to get the poisoned amulet to the shrine of whatever before the dragon awakens on the fourth moon of spring or whatever. Creating questions in the reader's mind by laying out some kind of conflict, some kind of uncertainty, will drive curiosity. You can't be bored if you're sufficiently curious. There's a subtle undertone here, something you need in addition to curiosity, and that's some kind of rooting interest. I mentioned this before. The reader has to care about the questions in order to be curious, which fundamentally means that they have to care about the characters who those questions are being asked of. Once you've established this curiosity, you need to make progress towards resolving it. This can take multiple forms. It might involve answering the initial questions the reader has, and in this answering of the initial questions, you create a bunch of new questions. We figured out which of the butlers murdered the first butler, but now that butler has also been murdered by another butler. You can also make progress to answering the questions, but put some obstacles along the way. Our dwarves don't get to the shrine until the end of the book, but they encounter a whole bunch of elves and orcs and other nerd stuff along the way. We delay answering the questions until the end of the story. Now, this progress, if not done right, can also cause your novel to become boring. Curiosity is a bit mercurial, and without sufficient renewal, it will drift away onto something else. This is the fundamental difficulty with the middle of a novel and also the middle of a video, which is why so many of you are clicking away from this video right now. When you get to the middle of a novel, you have to make sure that you're either renewing the initial curiosity or that the reader hasn't lost that initial curiosity. It's a dance between giving the reader some answers to questions, but not so many answers that they completely lose curiosity, and any new questions that you pose have to engage the reader as much as the initial hook did, and also maintain that level of curiosity. This is why novels have things like twists and escalations. The writer is trying to bolster that initial curiosity, either because some of the questions have been answered, or because the curiosity in the reader has naturally started to ebb. This brings up an interesting nuance, though. What if not every part of a novel is boring? Even a novel that you enjoy probably has scenes or characters that you find boring, or at least less engaging than your favorite parts of the novel. This is really common in big epic series like The Wheel of Time, where you have such a large cast and so many parallel storylines and so many different viewpoints that it's natural that some readers are going to find some of those characters and some of those storylines and some of those viewpoints less interesting than other viewpoints. People are naturally going to gravitate towards certain characters that they like more than others. This is ultimately okay, and I don't think it's something that you can avoid, but it's something that you need to be aware of. If you have a bigger scope to your story, you have multiple different plots, multiple different viewpoint characters, you need to understand that some of the scenes that those characters are in are going to be boring to some segment of the readers just because they don't like those characters as much as the other characters. What this ultimately comes down to, I think, is having a balance between your different viewpoint characters, not lingering for too long on one subplot or one character. Like, you don't want the third quarter of your novel to be entirely about one arc while all of the other arcs just kind of sit around waiting. I think having a balance so that the reader recognizes that even though this chapter or this scene has a character that I don't really like in it, next chapter we're going to be switching back to the other character, and then it's fine. You have sort of a balance. You're not spending too much time on characters that people find boring. There's also another situation that can happen here where you may have read a book that you find really boring, but you still want to know how it ends, so you keep reading. Now, some people will give up on these kinds of books, others don't, whatever floats your boat. But if you've ever had that experience of reading a book that you aren't really enjoying, but you still want to see through to the end, then you know what I'm talking about. What happens here, I think, is the reader is okay with enduring some boredom if the initial curiosity created by the hook of the story is high enough. If you have a really good premise, if you've asked a really good question, then the reader is going to remain curious about getting an answer, even if the story itself is not that interesting. I don't know that there's really a takeaway from that, except that you probably shouldn't rely on the initial hook or a really good premise to carry your story all the way through to the end. Every part of your novel deserves some attention to make sure that it's not boring. You need to make sure that you have excitement. You need to make sure that you're creating curiosity in the reader, that you're making progress towards that curiosity, and you need to make sure that they feel a connection to the elements of your novel that make it not boring. What you want to avoid is having a really compelling hook at the beginning and then just kind of a boring, saggy middle that just passes time until we get to the end. You can't let your guard down when it comes to making a boring novel. It's something that has to be managed throughout the entire story. Just like you watched throughout this entire video, because we're now at the end of the video. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.